The story of Saint Margaret of Hungary begins in a period marked by profound trials for Christian Europe, especially in the 13th century, when entire kingdoms were threatened by wars, invasions, and political crises. Hungary, situated at the heart of the continent, found itself vulnerable to external assaults, above all to the devastating Mongol invasions that left cities destroyed, families decimated, and an entire nation plunged into suffering. This scene of collective pain not only shaped the political history of the kingdom, but also prepared the spiritual ground for the emergence of a saint whose life would be a silent yet powerful response to the tragedy and the sin of the world. King Bela IV of Hungary and his wife, Queen Maria Lascaris, lived this time of affliction intensely. Faced with the imminent threat of the kingdom's total destruction by the Mongols, the royal couple turned not only to weapons or political alliances, but above all, to prayer. In the midst of fear and uncertainty, they made a solemn promise to God. If the Lord delivered Hungary from complete ruin, they would consecrate the son or daughter who had not yet even been born to a life entirely dedicated to him. This promise, made in tears and hope, would become the starting point of one of the most beautiful stories of radical surrender in the Church. When the Mongol threat was finally driven back and the kingdom began, slowly to rebuild, Margaret was born in 1242. From the beginning, her life was surrounded by a profound spiritual meaning, for she was not only a royal child, but the fulfillment of a vow made to God in one of the darkest moments in Hungarian history. Margaret's birth was seen as a sign of divine mercy, a concrete answer from heaven to the persevering faith of her parents. She came into the world not as an heir to political ambitions, but as a living offering to the Lord. From her earliest years, it was clear that Margaret's destiny would be different from that of other princesses in medieval Europe. While other royal children were prepared for marital alliances and games of power, Margaret was educated from an early age with the awareness that her life belonged to God. This awareness was not imposed on her in a harsh or cold manner, but transmitted with reverence as a sacred calling. Her childhood was marked by an atmosphere of prayer, silence, and spiritual formation, something rare even among deeply Christian families of the time. At only 3 years of age, Margaret was entrusted to the care of Dominican nuns, initially at the convent of Vesprem. This early separation from the court and her family might seem harsh to human eyes, but within the plan of faith, it represented an act of total trust in the divine will. The little princess grew up far from palatial luxuries, learning from an early age the value of humility, obedience, and community life. What for many would be a loss became, for Margaret, fertile ground in which her soul began to flourish. The choice of the Dominican order was not accidental. The Dominicans, known as the Order of Preachers, stood out for their zeal for truth, for purity of doctrine, and for a life balanced between contemplation and action. From early on, Margaret was introduced to a solid spirituality, centered on love for Christ crucified, devotion to the Eucharist, and the practice of Christian virtues. Even though she was only a child, she showed an uncommon spiritual sensitivity, surprising those who lived with her daily. As Margaret grew, it became increasingly evident that her vocation was not merely the fruit of a promise made by her parents, but of a deep inner calling. She showed no nostalgia for palace life, nor any desire for honors or riches. On the contrary, she found joy in the simplest tasks of the convent and displayed a spontaneous inclination towards sacrifice and prayer. This early detachment from the world was a sign of a soul shaped by grace from a very young age. Around the age of 10, Margaret was transferred to the Dominican convent on the Isle of the Hares in the Danube River, a place that would later become known as Margaret Island in her honor. This convent had been built especially for her as the full fulfillment of the royal promise. There, surrounded by the tranquility of nature and the silent rhythm of religious life, Margaret found the ideal environment to deepen even further her union with God. The isolation from the outside world favored her natural inclination for contemplation. Even though she was the king's daughter, Margaret refused any special treatment. She dressed simply, avoided privileges, and joyfully submitted to the rules of the community. Her attitude impressed not only the nuns, but also distinguished visitors who came to the convent. Many were astonished to see a princess who, having everything at her disposal, voluntarily chose the path of renunciation. This consistency between her origin and her spiritual choice made her witness even more eloquent. Thus, from her childhood and youth, St. Margaret of Hungary presented herself to the world not as a saint of great speeches, but as a silent sacrifice offered to God for the good of an entire people. Her budding life was, at the same time, a response to divine mercy and an ongoing intercession for the peace and Christian fidelity of Hungary. The seed had been planted, and from it would spring a profound holiness marked by the cross, by prayer, and by a radical love for Christ. Upon entering more consciously into religious life, St. Margaret of Hungary began to live intensely every aspect of Dominican spirituality, embracing prayer as the absolute center of her existence. The silence of the convent was not for her an emptiness, but a space inhabited by the constant presence of God. From early on, Margaret showed a deep love for the liturgy, taking part with sincere recollection in the canonical hours and the Holy Mass, where her soul seemed to rise naturally toward eternal realities. For her, each prayer was a real encounter with Christ, not a mere religious obligation. The young religious quickly stood out for her exemplary obedience. Margaret not only observed the convent's rules, but made of them a true path of sanctification. She received corrections with humility, accepted the guidance of her superiors without resistance, and saw in every command an opportunity to renounce her own will. This obedience was not born of fear or blind submission, but of a deep desire to conform her life to the will of God. For Margaret, to obey was to love, and to love was to offer herself entirely. Even though she was of royal origin, Margaret insisted on taking on the simplest and often the most difficult services in the community. She cleaned the spaces, helped in the kitchen, cared for the most humble tasks without ever complaining. She avoided any distinction that might remind her of her position in the world and rejoiced in being treated as the last among the sisters. This spirit of sincere humility deeply touched those who lived with her, for it was not a theatrical gesture, but an inward, deeply rooted conviction. Bodily mortification was also part of her spiritual life, a common practice among medieval saints, always lived with spiritual discernment and the permission of her superiors. Margaret saw in sacrifice a means of uniting herself more intimately to Christ who suffers, and of interceding for the conversion of sinners and for the peace of her homeland. Her fasts, vigils, and small penances were not motivated by contempt for the body, but by a burning love for the cross, understood as a path of redemption and communion with the Lord. Her devotion to the Passion of Christ was deep and constant. Margaret meditated at length on the Lord's sufferings, especially during personal prayer and in the stronger liturgical seasons such as Lent. She contemplated Christ humiliated, crowned with thorns, and nailed to the cross, and saw there the perfect model of total love. This contemplation transformed her heart and shaped her attitudes, making her increasingly patient, compassionate, and silent in the face of the daily difficulties of convent life. Another striking aspect of her spirituality was her love for the Eucharist. Margaret awaited the moment of communion with great fervor, preparing herself with recollection and gratitude. After receiving the body of Christ, she remained for long periods in prayer, often in tears, absorbed by the Lord's real presence. For her, the Eucharist was the food of the soul, the strength that sustained her surrender, and the source of all true joy. This Eucharistic love made her interior life ever deeper and more stable. The young Dominican also nourished a great devotion to the Virgin Mary, to whom she entrusted her inner struggles, her sacrifices, and the future of her nation. She saw in Mary the perfect example of humility, purity, and obedience to the divine will. In moments of fatigue or trial, Margaret turned to the Mother of God with childlike simplicity, finding in her consolation and strength to persevere. This intimate relationship with Our Lady strengthened even more her spirit of total self-giving. As Margaret matured spiritually, she became a living example for the entire community. Her silence spoke louder than long speeches, and her presence conveyed peace. The sisters perceived that there was in her something profoundly supernatural, a serenity that did not come from circumstances, but from a constant union with God. Even in moments of illness or physical fatigue, Margaret maintained an attitude of trust and abandonment, offering everything as prayer. Despite her youth, Margaret displayed an impressive spiritual maturity. She did not seek sensible consolations or human recognition, but desired only to be faithful to the calling she had received from her mother's womb. Her life was a continual yes to God, renewed in every small daily gesture. This silent fidelity made her existence a true spiritual sacrifice offered on behalf of the Church in Hungary. Thus, in the simplicity of convent life, Saint Margaret of Hungary advanced steadily on the path of holiness, growing in virtue, deepening her interior life, and becoming little by little a living flame of love for God. Her story was not marked by great outward deeds, but by a radical surrender that transformed everything around her, preparing the ground for still greater trials and for a holiness that would go beyond the walls of the convent. As Saint Margaret of Hungary grew in virtue and spiritual maturity, her holiness began to surpass the silent walls of the convent and draw the attention of the outside world. Even in enclosure, her reputation for piety, wisdom, and spiritual balance reached the court, the nobility, and even foreign kingdoms. For many, it seemed inconceivable that a princess of such noble lineage would remain removed from political affairs when she could be used as an instrument for strategic alliances and the strengthening of the realm. It was in this context that the first great trials of her vocation arose. Her father, King Bela IV, though deeply devout and aware of the promise made to God, began to suffer intense political pressure. Hungary was still seeking stability after years of conflict, and marital alliances were seen as legitimate and effective means of securing peace and the kingdom's safety. Several princes and kings expressed interest in marrying Margaret, recognizing in her not only a princess, but a woman of rare virtues. Among these proposals, some came with promises of lasting peace and prosperity for the Hungarian people. These proposals placed Margaret before a deep interior trial. On one hand, she loved her people and sincerely desired Hungary's good. On the other, she knew with absolute clarity that her life had been consecrated to God since before her birth. For Margaret, abandoning her religious vocation would not be merely a change of state in life, but a rupture with the divine will. This awareness made her decision firm, even if painful, for she understood the political and human weight of her refusal. Even in the face of insistence, Margaret remained unshakable. With serenity and respect, she made it clear that she had taken solemn vows and could not, in conscience, renounce what she had offered to God. Her no to the world was not a gesture of contempt for human responsibilities, but a radical yes to fidelity. She understood that true peace is not born merely from political agreements, but from fidelity to God's law. This deep conviction sustained her courage in the face of external pressure. The temptations, however, were not limited to marriage proposals. Margaret also faced interior struggles common to spiritual life, especially those related to weariness, spiritual dryness, and physical limitations. Her life of penance and prayer demanded great effort, and there were moments when the body begged for rest. Even so, Margaret did not allow herself to be dominated by discouragement. In silence, she presented her frailties to God, trusting that divine grace would be enough to sustain her. In the midst of these trials, her prayer life became even more intense. Margaret sought refuge in the Eucharist, in meditation on Christ's passion, and in the intercession of the Virgin Mary. Each difficulty was transformed into supplication, each suffering into an offering. Far from hardening her heart, the trials made it more compassionate and attentive to the pains of others. She understood more and more that the cross was not an obstacle on the path to holiness, but an essential part of it. Margaret's firmness inspired admiration even among those who wanted to see her outside the convent. Many recognized that her decision was not the fruit of youthful caprice, but of a rare spiritual maturity. Her consistency between faith and action became an eloquent witness in an era marked by fragile compromises and unstable interests. Margaret showed by her life that fidelity to God requires courage and often deep renunciations. Within the convent, her sisters saw in her an example of silent perseverance. Margaret did not complain, did not dramatize her difficulties, and did not seek human understanding. Her conduct revealed a soul deeply anchored in God, capable of crossing storms without losing interior peace. This witness strengthened the community and contributed to a more solid and confident spiritual environment. The trials also purified her intention. Margaret learned to offer not only what cost her less, but also what touched her affections deeply. Renouncing a future that could benefit her family and her people required heroic detachment. Even so, she trusted that God, who sees all, would know how to guide Hungary's history along paths higher than those visible to human eyes. Thus, in the silence of difficult choices and in fidelity to the promises made to God, Saint Margaret of Hungary consolidated her vocation with unshakable firmness. Her trials did not lead her away from the path of holiness, but rooted her even more deeply in it. Each no to the world became a deeper yes to Christ, preparing her soul for an ever more intimate union with God and for a spiritual mission that would outlive her own life. As the years passed, the life of St. Margaret of Hungary became a true living treatise on Christian virtues. Her holiness did not manifest itself through spectacular gestures or eloquent speeches, but through a daily consistency that impressed all who approached her. Margaret had understood profoundly that holiness is built in small acts, in constant fidelity, and in love lived in silence. This awareness shaped each of her attitudes within the convent, making her a continual example for the religious community. Humility was one of the most visible virtues in her life. Despite her royal origin, Margaret made a point of considering herself the last among the sisters. She avoided any prominence and felt genuine discomfort when someone praised her. For her, all honor belonged to God alone. This sincere detachment from human recognition was not born of insecurity, but of a clear vision of herself before the Lord. Margaret knew that everything she had came from divine grace, and that, without it, she could do nothing. Charity also held a central place in her spirituality. Margaret treated each sister with gentleness, patience, and attention, especially those who were more difficult or who were going through moments of fragility. Instead of judging, she welcomed. Instead of withdrawing, she drew near. Her presence conveyed comfort and security, and many sisters turned to her seeking spiritual consolation. Margaret listened attentively, counseled with prudence, and prayed silently for each one. Margaret's patience was tested daily, both by the demands of convent life and by her own physical limitations. Her health, often fragile, did not prevent her from fulfilling her duties, but required from her a constant exercise of abandonment. Instead of complaining or seeking immediate relief, Margaret offered her pains to God, uniting them to the sufferings of Christ. This attitude transformed her illness into a source of spiritual merit and silent intercession. Obedience continued to be an essential pillar of her life. Margaret did not choose the tasks that pleased her, but accepted those entrusted to her, even when they ran contrary to her personal inclinations. She saw in obedience a sure path to the will of God, believing that by obeying her superiors, she was obeying the Lord himself. This deep understanding made her obedience light and fruitful, far from any inner resentment. Another striking aspect of her holiness was her spirit of penance, lived with balance and discernment. Margaret did not seek suffering for its own sake, but lovingly accepted the crosses God permitted her. Her penances, always carried out with permission, had the purpose of purifying the heart, strengthening the soul, and interceding for sinners. This penitential spirit did not make her gloomy or distant, but profoundly serene and full of interior peace. Margaret also displayed a deep sense of spiritual justice. She was firm with herself, demanding in her interior life, but extremely merciful toward others. She understood that each person has their own rhythm on the path of holiness, and that only God knows the human heart. This balanced posture made her a welcoming and trustworthy presence, capable of uniting moral firmness and evangelical tenderness in a harmonious way. Even without holding formal leadership positions, Margaret exercised a profound spiritual influence on the convent. Her mere presence elevated the atmosphere, and her silent example inspired interior conversions. Many sisters testified that, after living with Margaret, they felt more inclined toward prayer, recollection, and the sincere search for God. She thus became a true spiritual pillar of the community, sustaining it not with words, but with her life. Outside the convent walls, her reputation for holiness continued to spread. Ordinary people and nobles believed that Margaret's prayers had special value before God and asked her intercession in difficult situations. Although she never attributed any merit to herself, she accepted these requests with humility, offering them in prayer and penance. For Margaret, interceding for others was a natural extension of her surrender to God. In this way, Saint Margaret of Hungary became a living witness that true holiness does not depend on great visible actions, but on a daily fidelity lived with love. Her heroic virtues, hidden from the eyes of the world, produced abundant fruits in the church and in society. Her silent life, seemingly limited to the walls of a convent, radiated light and hope far beyond them, preparing the way for the consummation of her total offering to God. As the years passed, the body of St. Margaret of Hungary began to show clear signs of wear, the result of a life marked by penance, constant work, and unreserved surrender. Her health, already fragile from youth, grew increasingly delicate, and illnesses began to accompany her continuously. Yet far from rebelling or seeking relief at any cost, Margaret welcomed each suffering as part of God's loving design, seeing in it an opportunity for deeper union with Christ crucified. Physical pain was never for Margaret an obstacle to spiritual life, but a means of interior purification. Even when the body weakened, her soul remained firm and serene. She did not allow suffering to harden her heart or darken her faith. On the contrary, she became even more docile, patient, and recollected. Each physical limitation was transformed into silent prayer, offered for the church, for her homeland, and for the conversion of sinners. During this period of illness, Margaret intensified her life of prayer even more. She spent long moments in silence before the Blessed Sacrament. Even when fatigue was great, her relationship with God became ever more intimate, marked by confident abandonment and profound interior peace. She did not seek sensible consolations, but desired only to remain faithful to the end, offering each moment as a sacrifice of love. The sisters of the convent, as they accompanied her suffering, witnessed an even more luminous holiness. Margaret never complained, did not grumble about her pains, and avoided drawing attention to herself. When asked about her condition, She responded with simplicity and serenity, often turning the conversation toward spiritual matters or toward the needs of the other sisters. Her chief concern was not herself, but the good of the community and the glory of God. Even weakened, Margaret continued to exercise a profound spiritual influence on those around her. Her words, few and measured, carried great spiritual weight. Her gaze conveyed peace, and her presence inspired confidence. Many sisters felt strengthened merely by being at her side, perceiving that her entire life had been a preparation for that final moment of total surrender. As the end of her life drew near, Margaret showed a serene acceptance of death. There was in her no fear or restlessness, but a quiet expectation of the definitive encounter with God. For her, death did not represent a rupture, but the consummation of a surrender begun in her mother's womb. Her entire life had been a continual offering, and now that sacrifice was completed in a silent and humble way. In her final moments, Margaret remained deeply united to the prayer of the Church. She received the sacraments with great devotion, especially the Eucharist, which had always been the center of her spiritual life. Upon receiving the body of Christ, her face reflected a profound peace, as though she were already contemplating what she had sought throughout her life. For the sisters present, that moment was a true witness of living faith. Her death occurred on January 18, 1270, when Margaret was only 27 years old. Despite her youth, her life had been fully lived, not in terms of length, but of spiritual intensity. Her passing was marked by an atmosphere of recollection, silence, and deep reverence. The community felt that it had not lost merely a sister, but had gained a powerful intercessor before God. Soon after her death, Margaret's reputation for holiness began to spread even more strongly. People recalled her life of humility, prayer, and sacrifice, recognizing in her a true servant of God. Many believed that her silent surrender had been accepted by God as a pleasing sacrifice, capable of drawing abundant graces for Hungary and for the whole Church. Thus, the final suffering of Saint Margaret of Hungary was not a moment of defeat, but of spiritual victory. Her death crowned a life entirely offered to God, sealing with love what had been promised even before her birth. Her story, marked by the cross and fidelity, now became an eternal witness that holiness flourishes fully when life is lived as a total offering to the Lord. After the death of Saint Margaret of Hungary, her spiritual presence did not fade with the silence of the tomb. On the contrary, it became even more perceptible among the people and the religious community. Those who had lived with her kept alive the memory of her holy life, and many began to seek her intercession with confidence. Little by little, reports of graces received began to emerge, strengthening the conviction that Margaret, now with God, continued to care for her homeland and for the Church. The first signs of this popular devotion manifested themselves in a simple way, especially among the sisters of the convent and the inhabitants of the region. People who were sick, afflicted, or in situations of great spiritual difficulty sought the intercession of the young religious, confident in her closeness to God. Many testified to inexplicable healings, relief from suffering, and deep consolations after invoking Margaret's name in prayer. These accounts, transmitted orally, spread quickly, fueling the reputation for holiness that had already accompanied her in life. Margaret's tomb soon became a place of pilgrimage. Faithful from different regions of Hungary made their way to the convent in the hope of obtaining graces through her intercession. This spontaneous movement was not the result of campaigns or official initiatives, but of the sincere trust of the Christian people who recognized in Margaret's life an authentic witness to the gospel. The devotion grew naturally, sustained by the living memory of her humility, purity, and love for God. The miracles attributed to her intercession reinforced this devotion. Reports of physical healings, liberation from prolonged sufferings, and deep conversions were associated with prayers made at her tomb. Although the Church always treats such accounts with prudence and discernment, The growing number of testimonies drew the attention of ecclesiastical authorities. Margaret's holiness was no longer only a popular conviction, but was beginning to be recognized also within the institutional sphere of the Church. Even so, the path to the official recognition of her holiness was long. The political and historical circumstances of the time, along with internal changes in the Church, caused the formal process of canonization to advance slowly. However, this did not diminish the devotion of the people, who continued to venerate her as a saint long before any official proclamation. For the faithful, Margaret had already been canonized by the witness of her life and by the spiritual fruits she continued to produce. Over the centuries, her figure remained deeply rooted in Hungarian spirituality. Churches, convents, and places received her name, perpetuating her memory among the generations. The Isle of the Hares, where she lived much of her religious life, came to be known as Margaret Island, becoming a visible symbol of her spiritual presence. This geographical recognition reflected Margaret's importance not only as a religious figure, but as the spiritual heritage of an entire nation. The Church, faithful to its mission of discerning with prudence, continued to examine the testimonies related to Margaret's life and intercession. Documents, accounts, and traditions were preserved over time, allowing her story to remain alive even centuries after her death. This care in transmitting Margaret's memory reveals the value the Church places on authentic holiness, which withstands time and cultural changes. Finally, in 1943, Pope Pius V officially proclaimed Saint Margaret of Hungary a saint of the Catholic Church. This late canonization was not a sign of doubt about her holiness, but the solemn recognition of a devotion that had existed for centuries. By raising her to the altars, the Church confirmed what the faithful people had always believed, that Margaret lived the Christian virtues in a heroic manner and remains an intercessor before God. Margaret's canonization was received with great joy, especially in Hungary, where her figure continues to be venerated as a symbol of purity, sacrifice, and fidelity. Her life, marked by silent surrender, became a timeless model for religious laity and all those who seek to live the gospel in a radical way. Margaret showed that true greatness does not lie in power or visibility, but in humble fidelity to the will of God. Thus, the miracles and popular devotion connected to Saint Margaret of Hungary confirm that her mission did not end with death. On the contrary, her life continues to bear fruit in the Church, inviting each generation to rediscover the value of sacrifice, prayer, and total surrender to God. Her holiness, officially recognized by the Church, remains as a silent beacon that illuminates the path of faith. The life of St. Margaret of Hungary remains, even today, a luminous testimony of absolute fidelity to God amid the complexities of the world. Although she lived in the silence of a convent and far from the great visible events of history, her existence exercised a profound and lasting influence on the Church and on her nation. Margaret reminds us that holiness does not depend on extraordinary circumstances, but on the ability to respond with love and constancy to God's call, even when that call demands renunciation and sacrifice. In a world marked by the relentless pursuit of power, recognition, and personal fulfillment, Margaret's choice sounds almost incomprehensible to modern eyes. She gave up riches, honors, and a politically promising future to live a hidden life, dedicated to prayer and service. Yet it is precisely this choice that reveals true Christian freedom. Margaret teaches us that freedom does not consist in doing everything one desires, but in surrendering oneself fully to the one who gives meaning to human existence. Her witness also speaks in a special way to those who face conflicts between the demands of the world and fidelity to their own vocation. Margaret was placed under intense pressure, including pressure coming from people she loved deeply. Even so, she remained faithful to the promise made to God, showing that true obedience to Him never leads to loss, but to fullness. Her life is an invitation to trust that God guides history, even when His paths seem to contradict human logic. For consecrated persons, Saint Margaret of Hungary is a model of religious life lived with authenticity and depth. Her sincere obedience, her poverty embraced with joy, and her chastity offered as a total gift reveal the deepest meaning of religious vows. Margaret shows that consecrated life is not an escape from the world, but a silent intercession for it, a hidden sacrifice that sustains the Church in an invisible yet effective way. For the laity, her life is a reminder that holiness is not reserved only for those who accomplish great outward works. Margaret never preached to crowds nor performed grand public feats, yet her daily fidelity produced abundant fruits. She teaches us that every small gesture lived with love, every suffering offered to God, and every renunciation embraced with faith possesses eternal value. Holiness, in this way, becomes accessible to all, regardless of one's state of life. The story of Saint Margaret also reveals the redemptive power of suffering lived in union with Christ. Her physical pains, her privations, and her interior trials were not wasted, but transformed into intercession and grace for many. In a culture that often rejects suffering at any cost, Margaret reminds us that the cross, when embraced with faith, can become a source of life, hope, and salvation for the world. Her love for the Eucharist and her deep devotion to the Virgin Mary remain pillars of a solid and balanced spirituality. Margaret found in the real presence of Christ the strength to persevere, and in Mary the perfect example of confident surrender to the will of God. These elements continue to be sure paths for all who wish to deepen their spiritual life and remain firm in the faith in times of uncertainty. The canonization of Saint Margaret of Hungary, centuries after her death, confirms that true holiness is not lost with time. On the contrary, it matures, crosses generations, and continues to speak to hearts. Margaret remains as a living presence in the Church, interceding for those who turn to her in faith and inspiring new generations to choose God above all things. Today, as we contemplate her life, we are invited to reflect on our own choices, priorities, and fidelity. The example of Saint Margaret challenges us to ask whether we are willing to trust God fully, even when this requires silent sacrifices and decisions contrary to the world's expectations. Her life reminds us that nothing is small when it is offered with love, and that God is never outdone in generosity. Thus, Saint Margaret of Hungary remains as a discreet yet powerful beacon, illuminating the path of those who wish to live the gospel with radicality and truth. Her story is not only an account of the past, but a present invitation to conversion, surrender, and absolute trust in God. May her example inspire our hearts to seek above all holiness, certain that only in God do we find true peace and the fullness of Christian life.